Welcome to this session, which is titled Opportunities to Enhance Strategies for Disrupting Online Networks Involved in Illegal Content Distribution. For those that have been working in online terrorism research for some time, Ali Fisher will need no introduction. His work has been some of the most innovative and original contributions to the field over the past 10 years. But in case you're not already familiar with Ali's work, Ali Fisher is a member of the It's Time Lab at the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart in Milan, and also Human Cognition Limited. This is going to be a session of two halves. In the first half, Ali is going to be presenting an overview of the VOX-Pol Gore report, which got a couple of mentions yesterday already. So Ali's going to present some of the key findings from that piece of work, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions and discuss the report itself. Then the second half, we're going to move into a closed session, by which I mean we need to think of it as a private conversation amongst friends. So we would ask that any discussion, any content that you take away from that second half just remains confidential. We want to really encourage people to feel comfortable to talk openly, and at times we'll be talking about some quite sensitive content. In that second half, Ali will be talking about different methods, OSINT techniques, the role of data science, the structure of the dark web, how to penetrate secure spaces, and so on. And this will really go to one of the themes that emerged from the previous session, which is about how to engage in multi-stakeholder work and how to really take full advantage of the possibilities of data science. So we'd encourage you to think of that as an opportunity to, from a policy and practice perspective, think of questions that you would like to know the answer to, and then Ali will be able to discuss whether it's possible to help answer those questions using data science methods. So it's a chance really to try and bring together the needs of policymakers and practitioners and what is possible using the methods of data science. So that's the overview of the session. I'm going to stop talking and hand over to Ali to present the findings of the Gore report. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Is my mic on? No. Is it on now? No. Huh. Yeah. Now it's working. Okay. So first of all, thanks very much for having me. I have a propensity to wander around, so I've got this on. So thanks very much for having me and allowing me to participate here. As Stuart said, the most meaningful thing I've ever done in this work is when someone has asked me, is it possible to do this? It's how I started working on the commercial side of the work I do. Back in 2013, my colleague and I met at a conference like this, and I was telling him I did the data science stuff, and he was talking about how he spent a lot of time in jihadi communities, and I was like, well, what do you want to be able to do? And he was like, oh, well, is it possible to do this? Yes, it is. And so we've spent the last decade selling the results of that conversation. And so what I really want to do in talking about these things is hope that people come to a point of saying, is it possible to do this? This is something I've had a question and I don't know how to do. I would love for people to have those questions and be able to discuss them in that second part or afterwards in the rest of the conference, or just email me another time if it comes to you later. Because originally I had a history degree, but I spent over a decade doing data science work in this field. And so sometimes we know new approaches come along and you're like, oh, I really want to know how to do that. It's like, well, I'm more than happy to tell you what they are. And one of the things that got us into that at the moment, as Stuart described, is the report we did with VOX-Pol. It was also done with Human Digital, which is part of M&C Saatchi. And it was to understand the broad overview of the environment in which the Gore content and Gore sites exists and is shared. And what we found was A, it was very easily findable, B, it was very easily shareable, and C, it was absolutely easy to be viewable. And on that, we are talking about some fairly hardcore content today, but we will not be showing any of it. No images at all. And it will span both terrorism and sexual related content, but it will only be verbal and written, doing the else. So that is what we set out to do. And the main findings of that report were that an enormous amount of traffic goes through those sites. And we're talking about millions of views a month. The UK alone was getting about 400,000, and that demographic was 25 to 39, I think it was, which, given that we've been talking about young people, is a fairly interesting number in itself. We're like, oh, we're going to worry about young people. There's certainly things we need to worry about young people for. A lot of the problems on the internet are created by people who are older than teenagers, though. So worth kind of just giving that an extra little balance as well. A huge number of those sites that we were looking at that were sharing, see incredibly violent content. Very few of them had any terms of service at all, and none of them had a specific mention of sharing of terrorist violence, things like that. All of them, are classic, typical websites. They're always on, they can all share. A lot of them have the capacity to share that content out into other social media environments and private messaging environments and whatever you want to call the blurred platforms that do both of those things. We found that things like global events, including wars, drive a lot of views. So if there is a particular event happening, that can actually drive a lot of people to view it through or seek it, and then end up viewing it within the context of gore sites. One important part to that is to remember that these sites are curated by people with an interest in the gore violence of it. They aren't necessarily the sites that are for distribution for the producers. And so it does give a little bit of a nuance when we're talking about them. So this is where people can access it, but it's not necessarily where people are placing it for the terrorist purpose. It is those are two different parts of it. But we found 12,000 examples, non-unique, of those videos with both IS and far-right groups. And then, as we'll talk about in a minute, we also looked at where the traffic to those sites was coming from as well, including things like incel forums. So one of the things about the gore sites is terrorism is a feature of those sites, as a category that they describe as terrorism and put whatever they want in it. Because it's curated, some of those things that wouldn't fit our definition of terrorism, but whatever, that's where it's going. A lot of it's war footage as well as terrorist attacks. Of the sites we looked at, 19 actually had a kind of terrorist type category of their own. Islamic State were the prominent producer of content, and often just the bit that people think of when you say IS content. However, what we were talking about in the report is that one of the reasons why we don't think that this content is being put there by the group and supporters themselves is because they're missing out the theological aspect of the purpose of the violence. They're just cutting out to go, here's some really horrific stuff, which if you believe you're in the pursuit of the law of God, it would be really weird to miss out the God bit within that. So this is why some of the indicators that we thought, actually, this is people who are finding these videos and going, well, that's a horrific bit, we're going to put that on this site, rather than it being, this is a purposeful attempt to distribute all our content in a meaningful way. It just doesn't fit with their purpose. After October 2023, content from Hamas and the carnage in Gaza appears a lot more as well. And in terms of viewing, one video alone had been viewed 11 million times on one of the sites. So there's an enormous amount of viewing going on, there's an enormous amount of exposure within the terrorist content, but often it is not in a conscious recruitment environment, but it is an exposure environment. So there's a slight nuance to the content around terrorism there. And of those, the classics that we talk about from the far right, and then The one less well known below was actually the killing of tourists in Morocco by people who pledged allegiance to IS. So they are all, they're there, the stuff's there, but it is exposing people to the content, but not necessarily by the groups themselves. This is a much more likely to be a spontaneous type of curation. And then connection with the kind of violent misogyny area, the interconnection between incel forums and Gore content was very obvious at a kind of systemic level. The incel forums were sharing content links across to the Gore sites, and then around a lot of the Gore sites carry a lot of adverts, and those adverts are advertising either illegal, very violent, or illegal and violent sexual content, and some of the commentary around why the people enjoy going to the Gore sites and things was about to see the abuse of women and things like that as well. So it is an intersection between those two aspects, and the visits that are getting driven are in the thousands a month from porn sites to Gore sites. There's many thousands each month, the traffic going either way across that. So you are seeing at a structural level an interconnection between viewing of Gore and viewing of pornographic and then both legal and illegal pornographic content. And then the use of a lot of chatbots and things like that as well to just add to the chaos that goes on. But it speaks to this interconnection between these harm environments. And what I want to just kind of draw together the thoughts from the report were that Gore in itself is a fairly niche topic to be looking at. But what it is an intersection between a lot of different other harm aspects that we talk about. We talk about violent misogyny, talk about child sexual abuse, talk obviously about terrorist content and violent and illegal content, and all of them flow through Gore sites. It's not the only way people get there, but it is an important part of understanding that this is one massive ecosystem for some people to view a lot of very troubling content. A lot of it obviously illegal, and then some of it not illegal, but leads to further harms in the physical environment. And so where we got to, we're thinking about the response areas, is that just as Gore cuts across a lot of the harm areas, the response areas that it sits within are a large sort of intersection of those. It sits within, obviously, your kind of policy, classic policy and platform engagement that governments do as a role there. Then the regulators and regulation of content online, there's an element to which that is part of the process. Law enforcement, where it is illegal and being done within a certain jurisdiction, there is an element of law enforcement involvement. And then one of the aspects that also came to light was the role of public health and support services within providing pathways out for people who are engaged in this and are now looking for a pathway out, which we'll talk more about in the other section. But what we realized in producing the report was that each one of those aspects in terms of the responses has a role to play. It isn't a question of we should do regulation or we should do law enforcement, we should do public health. It's each one of them had a role to play within this, because this is an ecosystem of content and it requires an ecosystem of responses. And that's where we kind of landed with the kind of the Gore aspect of this is Gore's cross-cutting. The responses also need to be cross-cutting in a way that each aspect of our government and civil society responses contributes to the whole of our responding to this type of content. So that's where we kind of got to with the report itself. We can do a few questions now, but also, once we move on from this bit of the thing, it will be a lot more of a free-for-all. People can talk whenever they like. So does anyone have any questions specifically about the Gore report itself? Yes, well, it's 2 questions already.
You want to go first? Oh. Thank you very much. I just wanted to continue part of the discussion from yesterday, which was around a lot of people have some interest in gory content in the sense of violent TV shows. You know, the media is pretty good about cutting off the most violent parts. But I think it's fair to say that there's still a clickbait element to, oh, here's this massive fight in a nightlife precinct or whatever else. So do you see these behaviors, the violent pornography, the gore content, as sort of there's a spectrum of human behavior of which most of us will fall in some kind of healthy range, and then this is just an extreme version of it, or is there something else going on? Well, how do you see that kind of connection to gore in more everyday circumstances?
Well, I think there's kind of 2 parts to it. People can be very into one bit of it and be totally disinterested and even repelled by another bit. So while we talk about the ecosystem, there are people moving around it. There are people who are particularly interested in one element, but it is, to me, something you can go looking for more hardcore end stuff, having seen, oh, I saw this, but the video cut off, so we'll go and get the rest somewhere else. Or because it's so shareable, the sharing being part of a much more mainstream feed of content, of which some of it is then becoming more graphic. I mean, certainly in the last couple of years, that's happened in relation to Gaza, that some of the content is journalists in Gaza, and then some of it is just pure gore content related to original programming that came from journalists on the ground and someone just editing together the most horrific aspects. So I think that my perspective is that it is part of a spectrum of interest, and that is to say that some of, certainly on the sexual side, when we were dealing with the sexual violence elements, the people we were talking to about that were like, well, you know, some of these behaviors are acceptable to some people, but that doesn't mean that we want everybody to be engaging with it in a non-consensual manner. And the importance of consensuality within it was part of that, and then accessing it by people who are not of an appropriate age to be viewing it was also an important part of it. So I do think that there are degrees of it where we don't want to put a bucket around it and go, everything in this is bad, but at the same time, accessing the content in an utter free-for-all is also deeply problematic, and creates pathways to other things for some people. Some people are just like, oh, I wonder what really happened there, and want to go and see it. Okay. And that speaks to the news end of people wanting to, you know, what really happened here, what really happened versus, you know, some of the very graphic accidents. It's like, why are you watching very graphic accidents? It doesn't have any purpose to it. You just are. That's what people do. So I think that's a long answer to, yeah, I do consider it part of a broader process, of which some will start on social, like genuine mainstream social media, and even watching mainstream news content and TV content, and then looking for more of that type of aspect. There was another question somewhere over there. I can't remember who asked.
Hey, mine's a quick one. I was just looking at your the relationship between pornography sites directing people to gore. Is that mainstream pornography, or is that illegal pornography that directs people to gore, or a bit of both?
Bit of both, because it's the banner adverts. So yeah, I mean, there are some fairly obvious commercial back end things going on that are driving some of the probably in most jurisdictions illegal content back and forth. But then there are that capacity for banner ads, which people are just buying banner ads, and the platforms don't care what it is.
Hi, I actually just wanted to add to that. You say that you have these like banner ads. Is it monetized, these like gore videos, these gore sites?
That is essentially the point for the site owners. For the participants, for those that are creating effectively a spontaneous archive, the point is the gore. For the person with the server, it is purely a commercial. Otherwise, well, remember, there might be someone out there with a particular passion for it, but broadly speaking, the way they connect together is there is a commercial driver behind some of that that provides. So yes, go on.
Thanks. Just on that, is there any evidence that you've run across of a link with organized crime in relation to gore sites?
We didn't see, well, in relation to organized crime, in terms of the content, absolutely. In terms of running it, no, I don't have a meaningful answer either way.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions on the Gore report. One at the front here. Thank you.
Thank you. Were you able to, I mean, you've touched on it a little bit, but did the report go into actually tracing the pathway of how someone has come to these websites, and particularly at that intersection, or not so much? And then my second question is, did you see a lot in the way of sort of outlinking in terms of like individuals commenting to either outlinking, I mean, I'm particularly interested outlinking from Gore sites to other social media or other sort of platforms? Thank you.
So the first question at an aggregated level, because we were looking at it across 24 sites based on their monthly and global traffic. So at that level, yes, there are definitely obvious pathways and places where people are coming from to arrive at these sites. Some of them are other sites within this sort of environment. Some are clearly links that have been shared in social media. Some of them are. Now, how they got that in the first place was a question that we got to at the end of the report. Like, it would be really good to get into a much more social thing. I know that is what was discussed yesterday as well, is that it is a really interesting question about how that material circulates. These are only really the repositories of that content. Then it can be shared and distributed and become much more part of a much wider ecosystem from the repository. And so just as people come in from those links, the content goes out. Most of them have a share option to allow you to share it on your preferred platform. So in that way, the outlinking goes. But then the other question about specific outlinking, there was some. There was a little bit of, it depended on the site, because obviously some sites really don't want you to go elsewhere because they're getting the money from you being there. So they're not that keen on you going somewhere else, unless you're clicking on one of the banner ads. They get the money from that. So that's kind of almost like a kind of commercial constraint of how much is going on there. But you can easily go on the mainstream sites and see watermarked content from these sites, which tell you where to go and look for it if you want to, because it's just the watermark is just there. And you don't have to look very hard to find those on the mainstream platforms. So it's kind of an answer, not exactly what you're asking there.
Any more? Oh, Kieran again.
Thank you. Can I just ask a little bit more about the nihilistic aspects? Yesterday, too, we spoke about nihilistic ideology, and I wasn't so clear on what that necessarily meant in this context. To what extent do you see any kind of ideology, nihilistic ideology behind this content, or is it just pure gore for no real reason?
I think some of the ways people described it kind of hinted that they were talking about it in that way, but most of it was just, this is horrific stuff and I'm sharing it for the sake of sharing horrific stuff. I'm not going to describe it. But that idea that this is about as much, if you can think up some crazy stuff, someone's probably done it in real life and videoed it and stuck it on a site. That is what we're talking about. Some of it has a clear purpose. The terrorist content has a clear purpose. The war fighting has a clear purpose within its war context. And some of it's like, what are you doing? This doesn't seem to have any purpose whatsoever. And within that area, there are some references that make it sound like it is perhaps speaking to the area that you're talking about. Whether that's just because they were using the words or not, we didn't kind of get any deeper into that because this was overview style, what's the ecosystem? But yeah, there were people describing in that way. I don't know if they were really doing it or really meaning that, or really just going, well, we're describing it as this because that's a common term to use. That's probably the best way to sum that up.
Okay, any more questions or observations?
No, we're gonna.
Just one more.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much. It was very interesting. One question which came to my mind was, with, for example, the Charlie Kirk assassination video being so widely shared, also in its uncensored version on mainstream social media platforms. Would you say that content like this, for example, is like can have like a first exposure effect for people that then might go to these dedicated platforms to search out more hardcore stuff?
It can. I mean, if you want to, most people here remember the burning of the Jordanian pilot, the Helium Believer's chest. You can watch that whole version on Fox News website still. You don't have to go to gore sites for it. You can watch the entire version, completely uncensored, end to end, on the Fox News website. So, you want really, really horrific stuff, go to a gore site. Go to Fox News if you just want an IS video. It's certainly part of this ecosystem where we live in, is that some of this content is easily available in mainstream places. And if you then think about that, and what we will talk about in the very first thing is, you see it in the mainstream, you think, I want to find more about that, so you search for it. Bang, you are straight there. As a gateway to this stuff is, once you understand what it is you want to look for, searching for it is very, very easy. Which is, go. We'll go. And then, sorry.
Sorry, one more really quick one. I'm going way out on a limb here. Connecting the report with some of the issues we were discussing earlier this morning about artificial intelligence. So the premise is that one of the attractions of gore is precisely that you can distinguish it as real, as opposed to fictional or staged, saturated with fictional and staged violence. Is there any evidence of, effectively deep fake gore, or is that going to be a thing?
There are examples of the individual it's happening to being changed with AI. The original act has happened in the physical world, but you change the person who it's happening to, which I'll refer to again in a moment. But yes, that type of thing does happen, but it tends to be based on a real incident, which is then adapted through some AI model. Jihadi John being a particular popular AI model that gets remade. At the most bizarre end, he then starts doing dances and things with someone's AI dancing him. At the other end, it's kind of partly the original video and partly him doing something else, and then doing the act he was famous for. So, that sort of thing is going on. I think there's a degree to which it's kind of like, yeah, you can do pretty much anything with it. People still seem to like the original, I preferred their early stuff type thing than the AI at the moment, but I don't know if that's going to stick or not.
I'm just going to ask a question of my own, if that's okay. In the kind of discussions around content moderation and so on, the focus tends to be on social media platforms. What you've described, I think, raises questions about searches, Google searches like that. In your experience, are Google searches fairly unconstrained? Can this type of content and terrorist content be found fairly easily through Google searches? And is that kind of a weak spot in current content moderation?
Yes. And the reason I kind of politely paused there is I'm going to move on to what we were going to talk about in the second part, because that's the first example in the second part.
Well, in that case, this is.
So,
So let's draw a line under part one in that case. So we're going to move into part two now. So in case you came in late, part two is an entirely closed session. So please, so that everyone feels able to speak openly, please remember that this part should be treated as confidential. And Ali's going to start this part with some more slides. So I'll hand back to Ali.
So when we get to the end of the conference, this part of the conference won't actually have been recorded. So if you could avoid taking pictures of some of the things are published. If they are published, there's a thing with it, so you can see where you can get it. If it isn't, then perhaps it wasn't cleared for public consumption. Anyway, so the reason I'm now going to introduce myself again is because I first wrote about the use of media and the internet back in 2003 in the wake of 9/11 and what happened in the wake of 9/11 with image sharing. Since then, I've been on a kind of general adventure living with either people who are using the internet for illegal behavior online, whether that is living with jihadis in an online environment or those sharing illegal sexual images of children. And from that, I've spent some time in my kind of data science life, which is why I kind of really want people to think about, is it possible to do stuff? If you remember what was then known as the Twitter election in Iran in 2009, I think it was, I produced a network graph of the information flow through Twitter at that point. And then during the Arab Spring, there was another large-scale network mapping effort to show the information flow through that, and I did that. I then produced what was thought to be at the time the biggest network graph of the dark web, which we'll show in a bit. And in the last decade, have had some very close contacts online with terrorist groups and social sharers of child sexual abuse material, and was involved in the takedown of one of the biggest child sexual abuse material forums, where we were able to take it offline. I didn't do that bit, law enforcement did that bit. But then once we had hold of the server, because back in the good old days, we actually physically get hold of the thing, we then mapped the connections between everybody, both in the private spaces and the public spaces, to work out who knew each other. So when someone said they didn't know who they really were, we could go, yes, you do, because here's the message of you telling someone you've been to their house. And so we could roll up the network of people sharing things that way. I don't tend to talk about that very much in the public life because I don't want people to know that I was doing it. But all of that means that this is what I learned from that. Humans have evolved way slower than technology, and our brains do not process information anywhere near as well as the information devices deliver it. Because of that, we have to live in small-scale networks based on habits of engagement, and that causes us to create little structures which we go back to over and over again. And when you aggregate those structures, you give away the tendencies that you have. And when you can do that at scale, you can see how the information ecosystems work and who talks to who and what are the influences on the way that information flows. And every single network has something they coordinate around. If you can work out what that is in the terms that the users believe it, it's no good being an outsider and going, I've defined it as this. What it means in the terms of the user. So what I'm going to talk about in this is about opportunities for intervention. And that means intervention in the sense of providing people with a path out. It doesn't just mean putting them in jail. Can we get people out of this life? And how can we do disruption? And that means understanding the ecosystem as a whole, and particularly how the target audience experiences it. This is one of those key questions from my perspective between, are you trying to provide a safe environment for the general user, or are you trying to make the platform difficult for those who want to use it for illegal purposes? And those are not the same question, because you can make it nice and generally safe for your general user and still be exploited by illegal groups, or you can do a fantastic job of making it difficult for the, put all your effort onto illegal groups and it still not be a particularly safe environment for your general user. They're two different parts of the puzzle. It's not an either or, but they are different things. They have different priorities. And so I really want to say is we really need to stop mythologizing this idea of disruption as being anything successful in the last decade. I've lived through that decade, and having lived on the other side of it with the people who are distributing the content, they haven't noticed that this disruption's working, which begs the question why we think we have. And within that, we need to make sure that we decenter our Western policy for those of us who are Western. We have a tendency to think that things happened because Westerners did stuff. No, almost nothing in these environments happened because Westerners did stuff. And we'll get to that in this example. So just a quick reminder, over the years, it's easy to put this stuff out in press releases, tweet it, talk it. IS isn't online anymore. IS is struggling. They've had their networks trashed. They've lost Telegram. None of those are true. It isn't easy to find on the surface web. Again, just Google Firas al-Ansar. There it is. And similarly, they've been pushed onto small platforms. They're not on Twitter and Facebook. Obviously, they are. They can't use Google, really. And you can't just Google it anymore. Well, this was in the last issue of Security Journal, was an article I wrote with one of my colleagues on how, if you just Google it, you can find it, which, thank you, Stuart. You absolutely can just Google it. Let's not even bother with this discussion that we have to get any further than that into something difficult to find the content. Does it mean you can find everything? No. But can you find pathways to it? Absolutely. Can you find some of it which will lead you to find content which will lead you to more content? Yes. Can you find a video? To find the title of that video, say on Fox News, and then Google the title of that video and see where else it is? Absolutely. And then, oh, now I found the website that has all the videos on it. That kind of thing goes on all the time. That is 2025. We've had endless comments about how they can't use Google anymore. They absolutely can as of this morning. You can find the website with the links to all their other websites. So what to do about it? Intervention within the child sexual abuse area. There's been a lot of intervention running around trying to produce adverts and warning messages and not producing results. There's even a search engine on the dark web that does that, which is very cool. Run by someone I happen to know that runs the search engine for the dark web. And instead of delivering those results, they actually deliver other useful information instead, like deterrence messaging or surveys occasionally. People amazingly will fill the survey in. Oh, I was looking for illegal content. Someone said, no, thank you. Here's a survey. Oh, okay, I'll fill in the survey. Wonders will never cease, but people do. Anyway, that sort of says that was how one of the things I was working on was, well, okay, well, people are searching for this content. Does it lead to the same end? This is one of those questions. If you search for very slightly different material, you end up in different areas, and things you think are separate, actually you end up together. So this was actually part of a question about abusive sexual content. Not all of it illegal, but some of it definitely is. And actually that some results are very interconnected. And you'd be like, these are the sites that people always get if they, they tend to get up depending on the variations of the search. We've just clustered it and given it a name to give it a sense of what that content is. But actually underneath that was a series of different search terms. And those search terms were like, all these search terms land you on this stuff, whether that is kind of the rape and violent content or animal content. Not all of it, and here's another fun little aspect for our commercial question. Not all of it is genuinely the content. They're just giving results that claim to be that content. And when you click on it, it's another version. They just want to get you to the site. So they're actually advertising illegal content, but delivering legal content. The mind boggles where they are. And similarly, this was about age-based sexual content. the question here was, does barely legal content, that idea of barely legal, lead to younger content? Strangely, the answer was no, but age-based searches did. If you were searching barely legal, that didn't take you there. But if you were searching for an age-based category, you could just tick that number down and you just drifted straight across from teen into what we've described as younger. And then also from the other side, from schoolgirls teacher, which at one point starts way out at age play, adults, genuine age play, and then just drifts closer and closer and closer until it's clearly people who are not of an age of consent. And then other slightly odd things, use an abbreviation or the full term, you actually get completely different results for the same thing. So there are times when the search really, really matters, and other times where some things can just allow you to drift into other areas. This one was actually done using Google search results and then showing how they connected together. Anyone who's been around for a while knows not to use Google to search for illegal content, but the campaign that we were helping was on Google, so that's why we're doing it on Google. And then the last one of these is actually related to help seeking, to do with compulsive viewing of pornography. The idea of, you can actually get either software or physical blockers that block content. But within this is that the idea is about addiction, abuse, recovery, and quitting. Some of those things are very much on the psychology health end. Some of them are on the verge of violent misogyny end. And they're all in there together. So help-seeking behaviors, depending on what you're looking for, can lead you to, let's say, religious-based treatment programs, addiction-based treatment programs. One very interesting quirk, which was a group that definitely prescribed in the UK, producing an anti-pornography content that was turning up in results there. So you were searching for something which you would hope to find, that they were finding help, but actually were finding content based by a group that is prescribed in the UK for being a violent extremist group, because their perspective on pornography is that it is absolutely not allowed. So they were there saying, well, if you're doing this, you shouldn't be, and here's a pathway to not. So the help seeking is a very complex environment that can span from genuine healthcare to violent misogyny. So as a gateway, yeah, Google's still doing it. It's fulfilling its primary function, which is people search for stuff and it tells them where they can go and get it. It's still doing that, despite people saying you can't just Google it. As I mentioned earlier, one of the other things that is worth thinking about is, can you get into what people think of as the safe spaces and understand what they're saying? Now, this is a twofold opportunity. One, if you can get into a safe space where they're talking to each other, you can understand how they talk to each other in those areas and identify message vulnerabilities for help-seeking behavior. It's one of the things we did with child sexual abuse, is that if you can get to where they are talking, you can realize that they are actually discussing a number of issues that actually make obvious that some of them want to seek help for this behavior. And if you can listen to the way they talk, you can frame those messages in the way they want to seek help, rather than the way we view them and say, you shouldn't be doing this, it's illegal, and it's harmful to the child and whatever. None of that is in any way relevant to the person who's seeking help. You've got to give them the help in the way that they want, because you want the outcome, you don't want to be right. I am right, but it doesn't matter. I want that person to seek help. So one of those safe spaces is this one. It's a network graph of the dark web, 682,000 sites and the interconnection between them, which is 2.1 million connections. What it tells us is the dark web is actually incredibly interconnected, despite the idea that it's difficult to find. You just have to find your way, and then when you're there, you find the connections between it. So when we're talking about violent extremism or sexual-based content and sexual violence, when it crosses over into the dark web, that's not a kind of disappearing. We just have to find different ways to understand how they operate, find ways to actually get into the spaces they're in. And then the structures that they create tell us that sometimes the sites that are really important to them are not the ones where the illegal content is on. It's the ones that tell them where the illegal content is. And so sometimes it's about, can we undermine those pathways rather than necessarily being able to get to the content, because it's the dark web. It's meant to be difficult. It's what it was built for. US Naval Intelligence. Thanks very much. Another one for jihadi groups from 2018 started using Rocket Chat, self-hosted version, which meant that they have no privilege, which means they can decide who comes and goes on those sites. And so, you turn up, you ask to be let in, you get let in, go and see what they're doing. And so this is a graph of all the users that have ever posted in a room between 2018 and 2024 on the IS version. There is a version for AQ, but this is the IS version. And actually what it turns out is that although there's a lot of content, a lot of posting, it's actually very few people. And some areas of the platform basically rely on 5 or 6 different people to keep the content flowing within those. And then there's other areas that are run by other people. Removing individuals can have an impact. Historically, it hasn't worked very well, although, sometimes it does. One user went by the name Khorasan Lion, got taken out recently. Didn't really affect the site at all. Totally messed up their image sharing production, but they've got someone else to do it now and they've moved on. But for a while, they didn't produce any photo reports because the person who was responsible in that chain wasn't there. So briefly, it kind of caused disruption, didn't impact the ecosystem as a whole. Question for us here is, are we trying to disrupt the ecosystem, or do we like this tactical poking? Because tactical poking might make us feel good, but it doesn't change the ecosystem in any meaningful way. Just a bonus thought on that, once you can get into these sites and have a poke around, when you notice that the URL is being shared by the different rooms, we often ascribe changes in URL sharing to changes in Western policy. When you look at the site, who's posting that on this server, you notice that it's actually the person that's sharing it that is the biggest predictor of what platforms they'll be sharing content to. People who are growing up in a Francophone environment use different platforms. People who grew up in either an English-speaking or an Arabic-speaking environment. That is much closer to why certain platforms come and go, is because users who spoke those languages were sharing the content, not that there was some policy shift. We ascribed these shifts to policy as Westerners on an outside, whereas as an inside, it's like, well, we had a French guy do it. He used French sites. Well, okay. So it wasn't a policy thing at all. And then just another of those safe spaces was WhatsApp. Got into a load of WhatsApp groups, 57,000 users were part of either IS, Al-Qaeda or Hamas sites. Hezbollah and the others have their own versions, but that was 358 groups and over 50,000 people were part of that ecosystem. That was back in 2023. Again, being able to get into them, go over each round, see the way they see the world from their perspective, and understand a lot of the things we ascribe to policy have got nothing to do with Western policy at all. It's to do with something that's going on within their ecosystem. So people enjoy poking around in safe spaces. If we're going to worry about content and content hashing, it's always worth having a decent actual archive of the content. This is just a quick reminder. This isn't even all of the jihadi content. This goes back to 1984. Just a series of archives that we have collected. It's over 200,000 unique files. What we have, weirdly, and you start to kind of poke around, the same file turns up in Al-Qaeda and IS collections. Not the same video, not the same book, the actual cryptographically identical file. Someone has kept it from one release and put it in another release. Some of the stuff from Muslim Brotherhood also turns up in Al-Qaeda content. Some of the stuff that has been released many years ago suddenly resurfaces again, exactly the same, not an edited version or republished version, the exact same file. And again, a reminder, we tend to centralize our Western view. Just if we look at the PDFs that have been produced by Al-Qaeda and IS in English, it'll get up to your knee if you print them all out. If you print out the Arabic version, it's as big as the cupola at the State Library. 35 meters, so just over one blue whale worth of content. So, you know, if you want to know what they're talking about, that Arabic content is really important in comparison to the English. But if we're talking about disruption, we're talking about hashing, we've got to be getting to the core huge versions of the content. We can't be messing about with small amounts. This was one of the AI things we built based on that content, which is facilitates a system through content matching for forensic analysis, but also extracting meaning through kind of concept tagging, which was built off it. We can't really spend ages on it now because there wasn't. If you want to know more about it, that article describes how we built it, Decoding Terrorist Mind, or the website gives a little bit more information about it as well. But that just explains how, if you express it within their content, you can find that they consistently express things in the same way if you look at it through their eyes. And it then has this cross-read between Al-Qaeda and IS, things like Ranima, Zakat. They express it in exactly the same way. One of my friends runs Defy Abuse. I just wanted to put in, given the amount of talking we're talking about misogyny, sexual, and AI. This is their research on deepfake content. This was sexual content, but it's exactly the same technique that could be used in gore. As of their monitoring, in the last couple of years, there's been a massive explosion in the number of sites that are sharing effectively non-consensual content. That is, people who are pictures, nudify pictures, or pictures where it's pornography and they're putting someone's other face on it, things like that. That type of deepfake abuse, you know, we seem to have reached a point where people aren't producing a huge amount more new sites, but it's sustaining a certain level, and about 1,300 different sites offering those services. And that goes alongside the other sites, the non-consensual image sharing sites, which are also out there, which Defy Abuse do a great job trying to help people who are in that situation. So as we were talking about it, I just included that as a way of getting your arms around how much of that content is out there. And then just as an example to say why we don't want to too much mythologize disruption. Anyone remembers the 2018 removal, and I will some heavy quotes around that, of content. This was 4 days after the removal of IS content from Telegram's big thing. They'd all been kicked off. 4 days later, we did this graph. The average age of an account was 380 days. So none of them were affected by that. There is this huge emphasis to do big things. We've done this. It's amazing. Look at the numbers. But to the user experience, they were like, I don't know what they're talking about. Kind of like, I didn't realize it was happening. I was hearing about it. I heard about it. And started looking, and some of these people were talking about it. The users that you were trying to disrupt are talking about it again. I don't know what they're talking about. Slightly odd, but we can't mythologize disruption if it's not affecting the users. If they feel the pain of it, then it's working. If they don't feel the pain, it's not. Similarly, this was traffic across the traffic across the surface web to known IS content. If you take both ends of that transit, so 1.8 million clicks on short links from one end to the other, that was 700 platforms back in 2019. And since then, there's been a growth. So again, disruption has not removed their ability to share the content. It may, however, have made it less likely that a general user sees that content. However, I have a question about that. My challenge to people, if someone is saying, this is definitely, this is working well, disruption is working, has there been a change in the internet? Because that is the primary driver of the reasons that extremists change the way they behave, is that the internet has changed. There's a reason they didn't use Twitter before Twitter existed. Then Twitter came along and they used Twitter. It's like, okay, well, maybe that's because Twitter's now come along and everyone has seen this as a good service and they're using it. Has the target audience behavior changed? When the target audience shifted from mainstream social media to use Telegram, jihadis used more outreach on Telegram because the target audience had moved. Nothing to do with Western policy and trying to push them off anywhere else. The people they wanted to talk about were using Telegram, so they used Telegram. And then if there is nothing you can identify in those two, then maybe it's a tactical response to policy. If there isn't a reason that comes from the safe space data, things like, well, yeah, you've got a French guy sharing the links now. He tends to use French sites because he grew up using French sites. So that's in that little triangle below just kind of describes the story of how they've changed from 2011 when they endorsed the use of social media in a slightly more organized way through to today. We've just seen an expansion and growth, not this contraction and restriction within jihadi content. And so if anyone has not already had enough of my voice, you never know. There is the VOX-Pol thing. Like, I know it's going to be like 4 o'clock in the morning your time, but there is the VOX-Pol thing. And if you haven't been listening to the War VC podcast, very cool podcast, all about how Warcraft images in Warcraft are shared, and the next one has me on it as well. So there's some really cool things. It's done in collaboration. I think it's the University of Southampton and the Imperial War Museum in London produced the podcast. I'm on the one that's been released in early December, but there are some really good episodes about image sharing that are well worth considering listening to if you haven't. But that's my thoughts on the issue.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ali. And we'd like to open it up now to questions and comments. Soren, there's a mic just coming.
I'll turn this.
Hi, thank you so much for that presentation. Really interesting. You rattled me slightly, to be honest, because from the forensic psychology background, we're exploring in the coming year essentially friction points, like how do we disrupt these kind of pathways from like a psychological lens, and it's very much obviously on the individual user. I was wondering whether you can get any tips on what we should consider, what our guiding principles should be for designing this together with our software engineers and trialing these things and making them effective. So it's not just, as you say, just poking or pissing in the wind, but actually doing a difference.
Well, I think that's probably a longer answer than I'm going to give in these minutes. But I will say there is a difference, and this is one of the things that maybe I didn't say clearly at the beginning. There's just a difference between the different areas. You're trying to achieve one thing at one area and one thing at another. Just because you're helping individuals is not pissing in the wind, it's helping those individuals. It isn't changing the ecosystem, but it is helping those individuals. And so it's about being clear which of those levels we're operating at. If we're just doing one of them, then we're just doing the one. But I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that I think that helping individuals is a bad thing. It's just part of helping individuals is one part of the puzzle. Damaging the ecosystem to make it difficult for them to do things is a different part of the puzzle. Regulation so that general users aren't exposed to violent and illegal content is another part of the puzzle. They're all parts of it. So how do you design something at those friction points? It's a little bit of me, which is like, it depends on which users they are. If they're very heavily entrenched, it's a very delicate balance because you want credit for getting them out, but too aggressive and you are pushing them to suicide. So that's, for having lived with them, anyone who gets caught, they are 100% on the path to suicide. Not everyone does it, but the assumption within the group is that they are about to lose one of their friends. So catching someone, absolutely a good thing. We do have to look after them once we've got hold of them because that's our responsibility.
We have another question there.
Yeah. Hello. Sorry. Hi, my name's Jennifer Robinson. I've studied the extreme right in Australia and New Zealand for the last 22 years. And I'm really interested in what you were saying about the sort of the manipulation of salvation, you know, the people that are trying to get out and the way in which these potential groups are manipulating that situation and saying, you know, come to us. And what I find very interesting is in a lot of the court documentation that I've looked at over the last 22 years, has been a rise in, as they've been caught for their ideological offence, is the amount of child abuse or other, you know, violent pornography type stuff that is found on their servers and things like that. And obviously, you know, here in Australia, National Socialist Network are very anti-pornography. So they, you know, are probably manipulating that need in someone. Somebody's trying to get out and they are looking at this and manipulating. Have you found, now I obviously haven't found this link, but I'm interested to know if, I mean, obviously you looked a lot at the Salafi jihadist manipulation of that need. Have you found it on the extreme right that are going into these places and finding the people that are trying to get out of this life and then it's being manipulated by far right groups, especially in Australia?
I can't answer for Australia. I don't. I have done work on the far right, not as much as the jihadi work, but definitely within the help seeking around compulsive viewing. There are sites and elements which definitely speak to the violent misogyny connection to the far right, that bit of the far right. Yeah. Definitely in the UK context, because what we were doing was primarily UK context. Some of those people offering help, they were definitely at least a gateway to some of the things that were being discussed at the start of yesterday, all that kind of, the kind of capture and policing the role of women. A lot of that stuff was absolutely part of what was happening. A lot of misogyny, very complex relationship between misogyny and viewing, not viewing pornographic content in a misogynist frame was going on, which then had a lot of the other elements of that part of the far right. So I'm being a little bit kind of like, because there's obviously the other bit of the far right that doesn't fit that model. But this bit of the far right, there definitely were people within there that were offering help for people who are compulsive viewing, who were definitely at least a gateway to further far right and further right content, and certainly violent misogynist content easily. It was like 1 step to violent misogyny, 2 steps to hardcore far right.
We'll take 2 questions together. So one here and then Michelle.
Thanks, Ellie. You mentioned ecosystems now 3 times, I think. I am a white Northern European person, and when I look in a garden, I expect to see a beautiful, lush green lawn. But I live in Australia and I am forever pulling weeds out, spending money on fertilizer, watering, doing all sorts of things. And if I listened to the Indigenous people and I got out of my mindset, I would just say, let's make this wildflowers and rocks and it would be beautiful, perhaps not as lush and green, but it would work with the environment that it lives in. I wonder, can you see a path at the moment where we can plant our wildflower meadows?
What? You do. Yeah. No,
you're saved. That's my question. And you get to respond to both.
Okay.
So you get a moment to collect yourself. Look, my question is back to helpy stuff, and it comes in 2 parts. First of all, I am genuinely confused about, you've talked about the dissonant resources that come up when people engage in help-seeking behavior. I am confused about why redirect technology is not being employed here. Maybe you can illuminate that. Was it, can it work in this context? The second part of my question, still around help-seeking behavior. So I have a long background doing research on thresholds for community reporting on violent extremism. And one of the key things we've learned from multiple studies in multiple countries, it's about the importance of making visible and more transparent. Some of the systems that we need people, you've talked about the ecosystem of responses that we need people in civil society to be aware of. This is a mystery to most people, except the people who are actually using it. How do we balance the need for visibility and education and transparency on the one hand with some of the risks that go along with that on the other?
There is an element of redirect. It depends on the term because they have to pick where they go. That's both in terms of warning messages and in terms of advertising. In the UK context, both of them go on. Some other platforms, particularly around platforms that are willing to cooperate, but know they have groups that are perhaps sharing illegal content. It's like weird tension there, but they know they're there, but so they'll warn you before you enter and give you a warning message and redirect. But if you're going to go, they're not going to do anything about it because of the type of platform it is. So that is all going on as well. But sometimes it's like, we'll skip past the advert and down to the rest, which speaks to one of the reasons we were doing that original work, was to try and help think about what SEO changes would create the help sites chance, increase the help sites chance of appearing in the mix. Doesn't mean they're always going to get clicked on, but at least it's there. It's kind of trying to always be there for that period, because there's a difference between hot state searching and cold state searching for content. Finding or viewing an advert in a hot state may not lead to an immediate response, but they may come back later. Change device, one of the very important things to remember, particularly for child sexual abuse, they will change device before help seeking, because you have to separate your offending behavior from your physical life. Ironically, that has also led to some of them being caught and their life being destroyed. It is a really, really hard ask. You're asking someone to give up their friends and social connection, even though we know that what they're doing is illegal and harmful. You also have to remember that you are asking them to give up their whole social support network, and in asking help, risking losing their family as well. Because if they get caught with, why are you phoning the child sexual abuse helpline? There isn't really a very good answer to that one that's going to convince anybody, apart from I was doing it. So it is a very, very complex part of the path to trying to get people to call. There's a lot of barriers. Which leads me to the other question about the ecosystem and your problem with the lack of your fertilizer, and you didn't listen to the people who lived on the land, is exactly one of the problems we have. It's why I talk about decentering Western policy. The majority of the work that has ever been done to counter Muslim extremism has been done by Muslims. Just because we don't see them in the policy setting doesn't mean they're not doing it every week. They also have borne the brunt of both the majority of the violence committed by those groups and the violence done against those groups by the Western governments trying to defeat them. In all of those areas, Indigenous people and Muslims particularly have borne the brunt. And they're still the ones trying to fight. And white politicians are the ones standing up going, why aren't Muslims doing more? To which the answer is quite often rightly, we are, you just aren't seeing it because we're talking to people we need to talk to, not to politicians and policymakers. And so in this environment, there's a huge role for collaborative strategies. It doesn't mean we've got to get Muslims we agree with to say things we agree with. It means listening to the communities who we don't agree with on policy on everything, but that shouldn't be the requirement. They don't have to agree with us on everything to be a valuable partner in a fight against an extremist group. They have for many years, when I worked with very large organization in Indonesia. They've been doing it for years. They've been dealing with the problem of what we would think was extremist groups for years. And then someone turns them and goes, you should be doing more. And they're rightly like, well, you've just turned up, mate. We've been doing this. And by the way, some of your allies are our biggest problems. So it's a complex answer in that ecosystem environment, but I think what it really does mean is just as we recognize the custodianship of the land we stand on now, we need to recognize that the people who have been doing this the longest are often people we think of as indigenous people in foreign lands. And we're at the center of this and they're over there. In reality, they have been at the center of this. They understand the communities they involve in so much better than we do. They understand the nuance in the arguments so much more than we do. And the ecosystem in which we operate is one in which we often do not see the largest part of that ecosystem. And we have to, in a Salafi Jihadi context, get out of the way and understand how we can collaborate within that ecosystem so that we can have and help those who are the most credible voices to the communities we want to reach, to have that credibility without it being ruined by saying Western government gives you a badge of approval, which 100% guarantees no one wants to listen to them. So as an ecosystem thought, there's that less positive message about Western policy for us. But I think it is an important thing to recognize and say is that it has been primarily non-white people who have suffered the brunt of it and have done the most to fight them, even though in our policy conversations, they are often voices that are missing. Anyone else want a question after that?
We'll just take one final quick question because I could see the 2-minute warning at the back.
I better make it a good one. This is going to be a little bit niche, but I was curious about when you were talking about the kinds of things that move jihadists off certain platforms and onto others, and that not being a result of Western policymaking. I wonder if, do you have any reflections on, say, other policymaking, say in the Middle East or elsewhere where that has been effective or maybe hasn't, and lessons that we could learn? I'm thinking, I mean, so much from the Iraqi context is often around very heavy-handed, like internet shutdowns. Has that shown anything to be a little bit more effective? Is there something else that we could take some lessons from?
Well, yeah, ruining the internet for everyone will probably eventually have an effect. Question of whether it's overly I remember the era where we used to describe that as what dictators did. They shut down the internet. We don't want to do that. But yeah, I mean, in certain environments, certain platforms are very difficult to use, so they use other ones. If that is shutting down platforms because the government doesn't agree with the people on it, gets us into some very dangerous territory very quickly. It does work. You could turn the internet off and try. And then they wouldn't be able to use the internet, nor would anyone else, and it would be an entirely undemocratic effort in itself. Broadly speaking, my point about that is that almost all major shifts in platforms to do with Salafi Jihadis come from a driver within the Salafi Jihadi community where they found something that was more useful for them, so they went and did it. And then policy said, hey, look, they've shifted. That must be to do with us. You know, that's it. Certainly in some countries, you can make it very difficult because you don't really, you're not really bothered. Everyone, we can make it very difficult for people to access a particular platform. That's technically possible. Unfortunately, that means that everyone has to happen to everyone for everything. But yeah, it's doable. It's just, that's what we used to at the beginning of, let's say, the beginning of the war in Syria. That's what we were saying, we know who the bad guy is because he's shutting down areas of the internet. I probably think that's still where we should stay. But it does mean, some platforms get exploited.
Okay, we are out of time. So before we break for lunch, could we please give Ali a big thank you?